To my immediate left is Dr. Anne Charlotte Harvey, who is a translator, dramaturg, playwright, Professor Emerita of Theatre at San Diego State University. As a Swedish-born translator, dramaturg, Anne Charlotte is a former board member of the Ibsen Society of America. She specializes in the plays of Ibsen and Strindberg, and I can say she is renowned as the expert in Southern California on the plays of Henrik Ibsen. That's the word on the street, and I'm confirming it. Rebecca Jo Plant, my far left, is an associate professor of history at UCSD and the author of my favorite title of a book most recently, quote, Mom, the Transformation of Motherhood in Modern America. Mom. A work that explores the history of motherhood as a social role, a cultural ideal, and personal identity in the 20th century United States. She's a past president of the Western Association of Women Historians and currently co-edits the electronic journal and database Women and Social Movements in the United States, 1600 to 2000. That's 400 years. That's a lot of editing. We are doing a play that you're going to see tonight that, of course, we're not going to talk about much. You know how that goes. But as you all know, I'm sure, there was a play written by a man named Henrik Ibsen, who is a Norwegian author, in the late 19th century called A Doll's House. And we'll be speaking about that play, the original play tonight. Just for a frame of reference, I'm sure you know this, but about 6 or 7 years ago, a young man named Lucas Hnath was breaking up with his girlfriend. He said, hey, I think I'll have somebody translate A Doll's House for me, and I'll see if I can write a part 2. He said one of the reasons he did it because he thought the title was funny. I'm still working on that one. Interestingly enough, when it opened on Broadway, he moved in with his new girlfriend into an apartment. So this is relevant because the play is about partnership and marriage and independence and freedom and responsibility, attachment versus solitude, as well as domestic stability versus individual discovery. I'm going to first ask Rebecca to speak on what it meant to be a mother in Norway or Europe, the Western world, in the late 19th century.
Well, hi. I feel like you don't really need me here at all. Given is this working, or can I just?
You have to use it.
Oh, I have to.
And you got to get it close to your mouth.
And is it working now?
Yes.
Yeah, you hold it close to your mouth.
So, well, what I can say basically is that the Norwegian feminist movement hadn't really gotten off the ground by 1879 when Ibsen first wrote The Doll's House, or A Doll's House. So, he was really progressive. He was quite forward-thinking, and the fact that he, came up with for what was a really progressive play for its time, and one that shook a lot of people up. I think they demanded a different ending in Germany. They didn't like the door slam. So basically, it points to the fact that feminism at this point really was an international movement. So questioning.
It was or wasn't?
Was very much, and he was a very cosmopolitan man, as were many of the middle-class Norwegians at the time. So they traveled widely, they read widely, they knew about things like John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Women, and they knew about there was a big conference in 1878 in Paris, which was probably the first international, arguably feminist conference. So all of that was in the air, and those ideas were, really putting the question of what is it to be a mother on the table, to get to your fundamental question. Yeah. And I think one of the things that feminism did was it tried to put something of a wedge between woman and mother. It tried to suggest that these two things are not exactly the same. And that was novel for the time. Or I guess what I should really say is there was a difference between single women and mothers. There was a kind of social role for the single woman, but wife and mother were essentially, viewed as equivalent. And so, yeah, both in terms of the law, legal issues are big in his plays, and single women were treated very differently than married women in the law. And mothers, once you married, once you had children, you did not have custody rights over your children. You surrendered. You essentially, in the Anglo-American law legal tradition, which is somewhat different, but it's very clear, it's called coverture. And basically, you become one. You are covered by your husband when you get married and lose your legal identity. So, yeah, I don't know if you want me to go on there or to...
That's great. That's good. The coverture is an interesting word.
Coverture is an interesting word, and it's a...
Is that a feminist word?
No, it's Blackstone. It's a legal word. It goes back to the Blackstone's law dictionary, and basically...
Well, I'm sorry, the Blackstone Law Dictionary?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know anything. What's that?
Well, it's the probably most important codification of common law in the Anglo-American tradition. And again, it's slightly different in Northern Europe, but the notion
Peggy,
that... Sorry.
You're turning the lights out on us.
Sorry.
Sal modified them over here, Peggy.
No, I got it.
No, you don't. Okay. Why don't you come over here and play?
So just this notion that, you are under your husband's wing in everything, that you do not sign contracts, you do not enter into business arrangements. I mean, it actually, Norwegian women got out from under these kinds of laws much earlier than American women did. American women still had trouble getting their own bank accounts and checkbooks if they were married, that was an issue in the 1970s feminist movement. So coverture died a slow death.
From when, like 1200s, 1600s?
How
When
far
did it
does it go back?
start? Blackstone, when did that start, approximately?
Well, common law was a very slow development. He wrote in the early 19th century, so he codified what was a tradition that built up over, as you suggest, centuries. And I'm not an expert enough in the early period to tell you exactly how far coverture itself goes back.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you. Let me ask Dr. Harvey to tell us about Henrik Ibsen, why he is a major playwright of his time. Some people call him the father of modern drama, and what is his role in dramatic history?
That's right. His role in dramatic history, theater history, is great. And you, I think, asked in one of your questions, we got a little list of possible questions, why was he a major writer of his time? Much of it was timing.
Really?
The timing was absolutely right. If we had been born 20 years earlier, his ideas would have been too out there, not taken root. If he had been born later, he would have been mainstream and not had the impact he had. So another thing that was very lucky, I think, for us, is that he was early on translated into English, both by Edmund Goss and by William Archer. And they managed to get Ibsen into the English-speaking world very quickly, and that established his reputation. In fact, so much so, I'll just mention this,
Sure.
in the 1890s, 1891, Punch, the humor magazine of England, published a series called Punch's Pocket Ibsen. It was a series of parodies of Ibsen's plays.
Parodies.
5 of them, they were abbreviated, of course. Much of the parody came from enormous abbreviation. But they also seized on some features of the plays and really played them up. And that was quite fun. But what it does show is that Ibsen was so well known in the English-speaking world at that time that he could be parodied and people enjoyed it and loved it and laughed at it. You don't laugh if you don't know the original. So they did know their original. And the fact that 2 translators had vied for translating rights to him is also amazing. George Bernard Shaw was enamored of Ibsen and his ideas. In fact, I found a little tidbit there.
Okay.
Shaw himself once played Krugstad in an amateur production
Of a
of
Doll's
a
House.
Doll's House.
No kidding.
Yeah, no kidding, right. So anyway, he was a major writer, partly because of the timing, partly because of the English translations. And his role in theater history is also tied to the timing. He combined a happy succession of things. He was born early enough that he was influenced by the 1840s revolutions in Europe, which were so full of idealism for the future. It would be different, it would be good. And the freedom was it, and truth was it. And that was the young Ibsen. And he kept that as part of himself all through his life. But he also encountered the new ism in the arts, realism, in the mid-1850s. And he sort of internalized that at the same time as he was exploring his national heritage in history, the Vikings of Helgeland, the Pretenders, Danish and Norwegian history played into his early plays. And he also wrote some comedies at that time. He was all over the map. So that was another thing. A third thing that was fortuitous is that he was not good enough to stay at the University of Oslo, or Christiania as it was called then. He actually tried to get a medical degree, but it didn't work. So he instead became the manager of the Bergen Theatre. And that was lucky for us, because during his years as a manager there, he put on a lot of French and English, probably German, melodramas and other plays. He learned the form of the current popular drama. Then he moved to Christiania and had the same or similar function. So he was grounded in the playwriting of popular drama of the time. And that, I think, comes back in the way he constructs his plays. But then what he says, which is the real kicker, is of course the ideas that he himself wants to bring up. And he does not want to resolve them, he wants to put them under the magnifying glass. He wants to scrutinize and debate. And that's what he does that really upsets people. Because that's where he brings in the issues of, say, a Doll's House. A mother who leaves her children and her husband. So he has explosive material in an old form that is not upsetting anybody, but actually works quite well. The well-made play form that he handled beautifully. And he also has a great gift for the Norwegian language. He really does write well. And that shows up in his early verse dramas. He even won, I think, a stipend for Brand, which was 1860, 66. And then Peer Gynt, beautiful language. So there's a poet who also happens to be a kind of stage manager, who also happens to have very progressive ideas, like you said, and he puts it all together.
And he was a painter.
He was a wonderful aquarelle or watercolorist and an excellent artist. Yeah, he never really developed that though. He did things for some dramas, but that's another thing. No, he was very versatile. So does that answer that question?
I would say so. You satisfied with that answer? I am. Talk a little bit, if you would, Charlotte, about how he introduced realism into the theater. We're so beyond that in postmodernism now. Sometimes we look at realism as an old form, and in Ibsen's time, it didn't exist on stage, right?
It sort of did, but it
Little
was
bit.
in dramas that didn't bring up things to debate.
Okay.
Tom Robertson in England had done some realistic dramas that were called cup and saucer dramas, because they used real cups
Cup
and
and
real
saucer.
saucers.
No kidding.
No kidding. And
We don't have
Ibsen
any on
just
stage
picks up
tonight.
that tradition, but he injects these questions. And the other thing he does, which is so new, an open ending. In Ghosts, does she give him the pill or not? We don't know. In A Doll's House, what happens after the door slam? He doesn't answer that. And that irritated people a lot. They wanted to make sure that it was a happy ending, preferably, or a really sad, tragic ending. Either would have been acceptable.
So tell us a little bit about what this story that Rebecca referred to, this German actress who refused to do the play unless it was rewritten.
Yes, well, she was typical of the time. She was an actress, was quite good. She was approved to play Nora in the prestigious German theater. Hedvig Niemann Rabe was her name. And she read the script and said, well, I would never leave my children at home. And we think, well, that's irrelevant. This is art. You are performing a role. This is the script. But she said, no, I just will not do it. I cannot do it. And so, and this is interesting, Ibsen was always aware of how much money his plays would bring in. He had had early years of struggling, and he was a shrewd man. And so he had to struggle with himself, and he decided that maybe it was worth it to write a different ending for Hedvig Niemann Rabe, which he did in 1879. She played it. In that ending, Nora is forced by Thorvald to go back to the children's room and look at them asleep, and she cannot bear fighting with them. So she stays, and then Ibsen
She never walked out the door.
ending.
She never
She
walked out.
never walked out the door. There was never a door slammed.
There was no sound heard around the world.
Not at all. And Ibsen was very unhappy and said, that negates the entire play,
Yeah.
which it does.
Yeah. You know, one of my favorite, I've got to look it up here in my notes, but my favorite Ibsen quotes is, quote, "The strongest man in the world is he who stands alone," end quote. He meaning he, she, obviously. Why did he write this?
It's a good question. Do you have an answer?
Well, I don't know why Ibsen wrote that, but what I can say is that there's two very different strands of feminism, and he was tapping into the individualist one. So, you know, it's all about the discovery of the individual, and it's all about, you know, Nora's it's influenced by the new psychological theories that were percolating around Europe at the time, the idea of repression and internal conflict. And, you know, she goes through a kind of transformation that is fundamentally an internal transformation. So in some ways it's very much like the feminine mystique, you know, the unhappy housewife who kind of finds meaning in leaving the suburban, what Betty Friedan called it, the comfortable concentration camp, and got a lot of, you know, flack for that.
Who called it that?
Betty Friedan.
She called it the
Like 90 years later,
The
she
comfortable
called us,
concentration.
yes, and yes, a lot, and she, you know, she herself was Jewish, but a lot of Jewish people were not okay with that for good reason. But yeah, I mean, I think that basically, you know, today women have it so much better in Norway than American women in so many ways, and that has.
Today they do?
Oh yes, and that has to do, you know, it's like they've got 44% or close to parity in their parliament in terms of representation. We're like, wow, we've got 25% now. So, you know, and I think what that reflects is the other strand, which came more out of the labor movement and which really focused on supporting mothers materially, supporting maternity benefits, and you know, you get a full year of paid maternity leave there. You know, and that those traditions go far back to the time that Ibsen was writing, actually, when people started demanding those things.
That particular line that you quoted about the man who stands alone, is the strong one.
Right.
Thorvald says something like it in Ibsen's play, where he dismisses Nora and says, I cannot possibly accept this suggestion from you, because then it would get out. People would talk about the fact that I am allowing myself to be influenced by my wife. A strong man stands alone and is acting alone and is, you know, independent, and is certainly not being swayed by a woman. That's the subtext. That for a woman it was okay to be swayed. It was okay to do all sorts of things, to grovel, to forge, to whatever, in order to support her family and her husband. But for the man, he had to have integrity and be law obedient and all sorts of things. And there's a footnote there too. Torvald is sometimes played as a villain in order to make Nora seem like the victim who is absolutely our heroine. That's casting them in a melodramatic way. Torvald is not a villain. He is in fact a rather indulgent and at the time seen as a very generous and kind husband who plays along with her. He plays a role for her and he takes on attitudes that he can't really live up to. And she takes on attitudes too. So, what was the point I was going to make? Yes, stands alone, exactly. That is especially, thank you so much for that, especially important with Torvald, because we find out in the original that he has just been elected the director of a bank. And it's an aktiebank. It's a special kind of bank where the leader, the manager, has to have personal integrity, be absolutely above all suspicion of anything in order to make that bank work. It was a bank that lent money without security, and it was based on a good reputation and good name. And so Torvald has so much to lose that when he has that outburst at Nora, completely unhinged it seems to us, he is actually justified in saying that. He would lose his position, he would lose his reputation, and to him, that is it. And that goes along with what you're saying. Standing alone, being independent and strong, that's what counts.
And that's what Nora tries to do at the end, of course, which is, you know, really gets to the heart of what he's saying about gender and women's roles, that when women do that, it calls into question everything about the assumptions around marriage and the family and female self-sacrifice and, you know, what it takes to make a bourgeois marriage like that work. So.
A couple of years ago, a number of years ago, we did a play called Rapture, Blister, Burn. I'm sure many of you saw it. It was two women in their 40s switched lives, a mother and a career woman, and they traded lives and tried to trade lives for a while, and the career woman moved in with the husband of the homemaker, and the homemaker went to New York to party with the kid. And it didn't work, ultimately, but it was written by a writer named, I'm going to get this, Don, do you remember? Gina, her last name was an extraordinary Italian name with 95 syllables. Gianfrido, right. And we marketed the play as a feminist play, and we had a conversation after the play featuring some local leading feminist academics who told me it wasn't a feminist play. So, is A Doll's House a feminist play?
Well, the easy answer is no.
Okay.
And Ibsen himself was sort of asked, or it was suggested to him that this is a feminist play, and he said, no, it isn't. And he was speaking to the women at the 1898 conference for women, and he said, no, it is not. I never meant it to be a feminist statement when I wrote it. It is a humanist statement. It is about human beings being unfree. And that goes to the soul or the core of the play, I think. It isn't just about Nora becoming free. It is about both of them being in a kind of marital straitjacket with expectations of the roles that they had to play, both of them. They have not questioned it so far. Nora starts to question her role. Torvald has never even phased it. But in the 15 years that have passed before part 2, he has had some time to think about it, you think. But anyway, you will see that played later today. You will see that, right.
We won't talk about that here.
No.
She saw it last night.
Yeah. The whole idea, though, is that both Torvald and Nora are victims of a society that expects you to live up to certain ideals and play certain roles in a marriage. And it hurts both of them. And so Ibsen felt that he was writing about liberation of the human spirit, but he chose a woman as the example because she was particularly put upon. Both of them are suffering, actually, from this constriction. But Nora, obviously so, and so she becomes the main character. But it wasn't just, let's free all the women. That's not what he says.
Yeah, it's complicated. It's not what he says, but I think that that's what came out. And I mean, he was in dialogue with a Norwegian author who was a very, what's her name?
Camilla Collett.
Yes, thank you, Colette. And she definitely was a feminist, and so he was, you know, very directly engaging with these ideas. And he says to her later something along the lines of, you know, that you converted me or something in the process of, and so I mean I do think that he starts out with this ideal of you know, questioning us, and it's a very class-based play. We haven't really talked about that, but there's a lot of stuff about class in it too, and so he is questioning a lot of societal strictures, but it is a feminist play. It becomes a feminist play, and yeah, I think, you know, I mean, for me today, what makes it maybe not a feminist play is very different. Is Nora believable? Is she a believable character? And I find the transformation so extreme and happening in such a relatively short period that, I'm like, could that really happen?
There was an Ibsen scholar, Ibsen and Strindberg scholar, Inga-Stina Eubank, who was asked about the ending of A Doll's House, and she said, well, you know, it is a very tricky ending, and I have never seen one that I fully believed. So it is very sad.
What happens at the ending? Tell us in the original.
In the original?
What happens at the ending of Doll's House? Not the play you're seeing tonight.
No. The
Tell us
couple,
what you didn't believe.
Torvald and Nora, they come down from upstairs where they have been attending a masked ball party at the Consul Stenborg. And Nora is wearing her Italian fisher girl costume, and she has danced the tarantella and seduced the whole company. And Torvald is wearing a domino, because he had to be somehow disguised. And they come down, and he is ready for sex. She has looked very alluring all evening, and he can't wait. And she is terrified because she expects there to be something in the mailbox from Krokstad, who has threatened to put something there that will expose her as the forger she is. She forged her father's signature on some papers to get the loan to save Torvald's life earlier on. You may remember that if you have ever read or seen the play. How many of you have read or seen Doll's House 1? Oh. Well then, you have something to draw on here. But anyway, they come back from the party, and Nora is in a very strange mood because she knows that the letter is in the mailbox, and she keeps sort of hinting that don't look at the mailbox tonight. While Torvald, of course, has to look at the mailbox. This is part of the melodrama structure, that you have to have things that coincide and happen at just the right moment in order for things to really work, driving the machinery of the plot. So he looks in the mailbox. She is now changing out of her Italian costume in the other room, and Torvald reads the letter. And he blows up, and it's a beautiful explosion, and says, "You did this to me."
That's very believable.
Yes. And the whole thing about what this means to me. I will lose everything that's dear to me. You have been a horrible wife to me, and I cannot believe you did this. And she tries to say, I did it to save your life, Torvald, but she never quite gets that line out. So he never finds out why she forged the signature. It's just the fact that she did it and that he will be exposed. And so she comes out of the room when he yells at her, and she has changed clothes. She's wearing an everyday costume, probably a travel suit. And he says, what do you mean? You changed out of your clothes? Yes, I have, she said. And then she starts to talk to him and say, we have never spoken together really about anything serious in the 8 years we've been married. You've treated me like a doll. My father did the same thing to me before we were married, and now I have been performing for you like a little bird, and I have pleased you, and you have played your part, and we have never actually discussed anything seriously. I can't believe I have lived with a stranger for 8 years. So now I'm leaving. It's a little sudden. But she is prepared. She has changed her clothes. She has packed a little knapsack, and she is prepared to walk out the door. The only thing she says at the end that gives a little tiny bit of hope is that she says, well, you know, in order for our marriage to work, it would have to be the most magnificent, or the most vidunderly would have to happen. And what is that? He says, our marriage would have to become a true marriage. The definition of that is never really given. And she walks out, and he doesn't weep, but he puts his hands on his face and sits down and sort of despairs. And then you hear from downstairs, Ibsen is very clear about that. They live on the second floor. But downstairs is the large, heavy door to the entire wooden building where they live. That's the door that slams, not the door to the living room where they have been talking. It's the heavy outside door, so there is a delay. She leaves, she walks out that door, he sits, and then he thinks, the vidunderly, maybe the most, what could happen, it's like a glimmer of hope. And then he hears the heavy slam, nedenfra, says Ibsen, from down below. And that means everyone at the time would have understood exactly how that house was laid out. And that it is a very decisive, heavy outer door that closes. So that's what they didn't get in the Hedvig Niemann Rabe production, since she never left.
Well, I have a couple of responses to that. One is, I'm sorry we didn't schedule in repertory you telling us the story of the entire Doll's House, and then the audience getting to see the production of it, because that was an astonishing story. And where else can you go and for the price of one ticket get 2 shows at once, which we just did? So thank you, Doctor. I want to take this opportunity. I'm Sam Woodhouse. I'm the Artistic Director here, and I've been hosting these salons for quite a number of years. And for a number of years, these two incredible people right here, particularly this woman, Suzanne and Lawrence Hess, have been sponsoring the salon. I just want to say thank you for doing this. And thank you for all that. I'm astonished by that story. I'm gonna, from now on, every play we do, I'm gonna have you come and tell us the predecessor of before we do. Let's see. Well, 30. We got a couple of minutes. So here's a quick question. So you've described this so well as what happened in the theater. So how did the public respond to this? Just tell us what happened.
The public did not rebel. Women did not immediately rebel, but it was as if a wedge had been driven into social interaction. And everyone who was anybody, and that doesn't mean the servants or the nannies. It means the educated, literate men and women who could afford books and who could also go to the theater. They were aware of what was happening, and they reacted to the play in such a way, so strongly, wanting to discuss it with each other, that there were dinner invitations sent out. Please come for dinner, but do not talk about the Doll's House. And that's true, both in Sweden and in Norway.
I don't know what else to say to that. Does anybody have a really pithy question? Yes, sir.
You say that
I'll repeat it.
going out the door is a sudden change in your life. But it was something that was building up for a long time apparently, and whatever happened that night was the straw that broke the camel's back. So perhaps it was a surprise to Torvald but it was not unexpected by her.
I think he's suggesting that Nora's departure was not unexpected by Nora, but a surprise to Torvald, and therefore maybe not really a surprise. That's my cheap paraphrase, sorry.
I think I disagree with that, and that is partly the reason why the ending seems so difficult. We have so few opportunities to see Nora as herself before the ending that we have very few guidelines about how she really feels about where she is and who she is. I'm not sure there's been much conscious preparation for that leaving. Things come to a head, and they come to a head very quickly, and then suddenly it's just like pulling a curtain, and there she goes. But they could have been brewing without her even knowing it beforehand. What we see at the beginning, this is another thing though for an actor, what we see at the beginning, we remember Helmer, her husband, Torvald, and Nora behaving like two little, I don't know, turtle doves or something, playing these roles with each other. And if we believe that that twittering little bird or squirrel is the real Nora, we are in for a huge surprise, and that isn't, because there are a couple of opportunities in the play where she's alone on stage, and we can see exactly how frustrated or angry or tired or desperate or fearful she really is, but it isn't clear what she wants to do about it, and that I think comes clearer at the end. So if you buy Ibsen's descriptions of these characters, and he is masterful, then you sort of swallow the whole thing, and you buy the fact that she walks out. But if you scrutinize it and analyze it, you may well ask, as you do, is this really, and you said also, is it really believable? One other thing that preoccupied people at the time, just as much as her leaving, which of course was disgraceful and illegal and all sorts of things, it was what would happen to Nora afterwards. And there was so much preoccupied people's minds at the time. They wanted to know, was it happy, was it unhappy? And so there were sequels written to the play. There was one sequel in which Nora ended up working cleaning fish in a cannery. Not good. There was one in which she became an opera singer. Because clearly she must have had a beautiful voice to be called a little Mark all along. But there was one which I think took the prize. She actually trains as a nurse, and then she goes out on the battlefield in a war, and there she manages to save the life of a man, a soldier who's been wounded. And who should it be but Torvald? Oh. So they come together again, and happy ending. And then there is the parody that I mentioned before by Punch's Ibsen, Pocket Ibsen. In that parody, Nora, we know what happens at the end, because after she has slammed the door, there is a beat, and then there is a soft knock on the door, and this is the living room door. And Nora comes back in looking a bit shamefaced after being let back in. She says, oh, you know, I was going to go educate myself, but I realized that all the schools and libraries are closed at this hour, so I have to come back for 2 hours.
The British humor.
That was the British humor.
There's a British joke.
Maybe you can say, what is it about the ending that demands people to think, what happens to Nora afterwards?
Actually,
how can she
I'm going
manage?
to answer the question by saying we need to conclude this salon. And you know what? We actually have an answer to that. It's called The Doll's House Part 2. It starts at 8 o'clock. You're going to see that. I just want to thank Dr. Rebecca Jo Plant and Dr. Anne Charlotte Harvey for being our guests. Thank you all for coming. Sam's Salon happens the Thursday night after opening. The next salon is after the opening night of Aubergine, which is a play with Korean American and Korean characters in it and features everything you always needed to know about Korean culture, including food and drink. See you, I think it's in January, maybe February. Thank you for coming. Enjoy Doll's House Part 2. Thank you. Thank you.